difference, we make it clear.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Spacepower Podcast, the official podcast of the Space Force Association, where we explore the people and partnerships driving the future of U.S. space power. I'm your host, Bill Woolf, the founder and CEO of the Space Force Association. Today, I'm honored to be joined by one of the most respected and forward-thinking leaders in aerospace, Mr. Tory Bruno, President and CEO of United Launch Alliance. Tory, thanks so much for joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure, Bill.
Hey, before we get started, sir, let me just talk about all the great work that's being done there at ULA under your leadership. You've maintained the gold standard for national security launch, but you've also advanced the next generation of American launch capability with Vulcan. Some would say the Ferrari of rockets, built specifically for national security, deep space missions, and with the requirements of tomorrow's domain. Let's just go through the report card. Just last month, ULA completed another flawless mission, launching the Viasat-3 broadband satellite on its Atlas V, and this following the successful Project Kuiper deployment for Amazon, delivering 27 operational satellites, expanding global broadband access, all the while continuing Vulcan production at scale, reinforcing customer confidence in ULA as the nation transitions to its next generation launch architecture. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that Vulcan has officially launched its first national security payload this year. All these missions underscore the critical role ULA plays in strategic deterrence, resilient access to orbit, and the industrial base that underpins U.S. space power. Today, what we're going to do is dive into what assured access to space really means in a contested era, how the Vulcan rocket strengthens Americans' competitive edge, and where ULA is headed next, and why innovation in launch is foundational to national defense. Tory, your leadership has guided ULA through a remarkable evolution, from exclusive national security missions to a growing portfolio of commercial launches. How has this balance between government and commercial work reshaped ULA's long-term strategy?
Yeah, well, very significantly, Bill, I must say. And I think I would start this story maybe even one step earlier than the commercial contract because it's so important for the industrial base to support the government's needs and to understand that as the nation faces into adversaries, that they get a vote. And so those needs change with time. When I first came to ULA, I got a phone call, and I guess I won't say who it is. We'll call that person General P. And that person said, "Hey, Tory, here's what we need. You know, we need not to be dependent on Russia anymore. So that's the Atlas V's first stage engine, and you know, we really want to have competition. You're a sole source provider now, but we'd like to have competition and lower prices as a result. And by the way, that means you're going to split your emissions with this new provider, so you're going to be cheaper at half the volume." And actually, I completely rogered up to all of that because whenever it's possible to have multiple providers in a segment to the government, it's in the country's best interest, and it's actually healthier for the providers because that's how you justify R&D through that competitive environment. And so we set about, you know, really streamlining this business. I had 4 rockets, I had 5 launch pads, and I needed to retire all of those rockets in favor of one rocket that could do it all. That's the Vulcan that you talked about, and really get those sort of 5 launch lanes, is another way to think about it, down to kind of like 2, and really 1.5, because most of the launches for anyone will go out of Cape Canaveral because you just don't fly out of Vandenberg that often because there isn't as big a demand for polar missions, which is what Vandenberg is suited for. So we set about doing it. And then before we even finished Vulcan, I got another phone call. We'll call this person General R. And this person said, "Hey, Tory, actually what's going on now is China is becoming a really serious and immediate threat, both here on Earth and in space. And so now what the country needs is not just a focus on cost. We still like lower cost. We never give that up. But we need a much wider industrial base, and we need a lot more launch infrastructure, and we need much higher launch rates out of everybody but we don't have all the money for that just yet. So we'd like you to go out and find a commercial customer that can help you build all that infrastructure out so it is there for the country's need. And so then we said, okay, so you don't want me to be at half the launch rate that I was at, like you asked for a couple of years ago. Now you'd like to be at double or more. And okay, so be it. So we'll open up another launch lane at Cape Canaveral. We've just closed a bunch. Now we're going to open up another one and we're going to go seek a customer. And we did, and we hunted around and we found Amazon. They had a critical need coming and we were in the right spot to support them. And so we took all that on. What did that do for the industrial base, which is a resource to our nation? Well, it meant that on entirely private money, we doubled our launch capacity. That meant we doubled our throughput in our factory and all the way through our supply chain, except for solid rocket motors, where because of the type of missions that our commercial customer flies, we actually ended up having to quadruple the entire US large rocket motor production capacity, which we have now done. And so it was, an example of this great partnership between, the government and private industry and commercial applications that is really the power of our system that China does not enjoy in a directed economy. And so that's where we are now. We are ramping up Vulcan. We are flying out the last of the Atlases. Most of those will probably be gone by next year. We have just 4 more commercial Atlases to go, and then a handful of government Atlases, and that'll be the end of them. And we're off to the next phase. Now, there's some unique things about this, maybe I'll touch on, because now it's 2 very different customers. And so you've got this commercial customer on the one hand that's going to LEO. They're only going to one place over and over and over. There are no other orbits. The inclinations change, there's only small changes in altitude, but it's basically reflying the same mission. There's changes as they upgrade their satellites, but that comes in big blocks. So it's all about speed and having control over their manifest, their destiny. And then in the other lane, well, we have the government customer where every mission is a snowflake. These are exotic because we specialize in that for them too, even within the government space. Things like the direct injection to GSO missions. They all have different needs for their payloads. Their spans are not the same. When we first started this story, it took a solid 3 months on average for us to assemble a rocket at Cape Canaveral and integrate a payload and go. We're down to 4 weeks now on average, and we'll drive that to 3 weeks. But the government missions will be 3 weeks sometime and more when they need it. And they also want control of their manifest. There might be a day when they say, I'd really rather move this Space Force mission over here, maybe pull up a GPS. So they want that flexibility. So they both want that. And so the way we manage it for these 2 customers is the 2 lanes. Amazon lives in their lane and the government lives in their lane, and then they both feel that they have complete control of that.
Thank you for that, Tori. Really do appreciate the breakdown and cadence. And I tell you, that's going to be, I think, the name of the game going forward is how quickly we can get capabilities into orbit based on a variety of customers. So you spoke about Amazon Project Kuiper as one of those customers. How does the commercial missions like Kuiper strengthen the industrial base, improve launch cadence, and benefit the national security community that relies on Vulcan?
Yeah, well, it builds all that infrastructure we just talked about without the government needing to invest directly in it because it's supported by that commercial market and those customers. But it also provides practice at, what you might think of as a wartime launch rate, should God forbid that's ever been called upon, and all of those resources available to be repurposed in that way. The other thing it does on both sides, remember I said a moment ago that the competition is healthy for companies because it's what allows you to invest in R&D. You can't go to your board of directors and say, "Hey, I got this really cool thing I want to do. It's only going to cost $1 billion." And no, I'm not going to get any more business afterwards. You got to be able to change the future when you make those investments. And so those two customers together provide that now. And we're in it with China now. They're developing and fielding anti-satellite weapons and broader space warfighting capabilities every day. And this is going to be another Cold War like scenario where we introduce a capability, they counter it, we have to agilely shift to something new to counter theirs, anticipate where they're going, not just always react. Right now, we're mostly reacting because we're doing a little bit of catch up. But very soon, the Space Force is going to have to be anticipating and getting in front of that puck and letting China waste their investment, because when they get there with their capability, it isn't effective anymore because we've already countered it. And all of this depends a lot on volume and infrastructure in the ability to invest in R&D, and that's what this healthy environment is creating.
Yeah, that's perfect. You just launched the Viasat 3 broadband satellite from Florida, highlighting ULA's continued partnership with major communication providers. How are these final Atlas flights helping ULA refine processes, manufacturing, speed, and mission assurance approaches as Vulcan becomes the primary workhorse?
Yeah, well, it's practice and it's like pathfinding because there's so many things that are different. I mean, obviously, the infrastructure we talked about, in large part, it's just more. The rocket is more flexible, but there's a whole host of other things, and you touched on them in your question. In the past, when the US launch rate for national security was pretty modest, every rocket could be treated like its own special child. And every little thing could be understood individually about that rocket, and any question could be ground to dust before you flew it. And then anything you saw afterwards had that experience before you would commit to flying the next one. Well, you can't do that when you're flying, multiple times a month. So it has to shift from that one of a kind model to a fleet model where you trust your quals, you monitor your data in parallel, you do quick assessments between launches to have reasonable confidence, and you move out. I have a lot of experience with that in my prior life, in nuclear deterrent systems and missile defense systems that are done that way because they're high volume. So we have to bring that into the space launch vehicle, heavy class, exotic liquid fueled rocket world. And these early missions with Atlas are helping us practice those processes and get our people trained on them. Even if I think I know how to do it, that doesn't do much good if nobody else at ULA does.
Great perspective. And the Atlas V has continued to perform even as you were bringing the Vulcan online. How did you manage this transition between proven heritage systems and the new generation of launch vehicles?
Yeah, that's a great question because up to this point, we've really been talking about stuff, technology in the rocket and in the factory and all that automation and all these launch lanes. But ultimately, this business, all of these aerospace products, they're about people because it's in their head, it's in their dedication to the mission. You can't write everything down. And so the way we got from there to here was cross training our population. We had people for probably several years on dedicated to Delta, dedicated to Atlas. I'd already retired Delta 2 pretty early on in the tenure. And then Vulcan was a separate team doing development because that's what you need to do. And we viewed this as a people problem. So even as we were going through the reductions associated with that first phase I talked about, the first thing we did is sort of design an ideal population distribution of experiences and skills so that we could drive ourselves to that as people retired or honestly, early in that journey, there was a reduction in force that was pretty substantial that was necessary to do. But we did it in a way that arrived at the right mix of people, and then we cross-train them, cross-train, cross-train. No more, hey, I'm a Delta engineer. No, no, no. There's only ULA engineers, so that where we sit today, The Atlas and Vulcan people are the same people. They go back and forth between these missions, and they're all very experienced on both platforms because that's the only way to do it.
Yeah, I really like your sentiment towards mission-driven leadership, Tori. That's exactly what you're getting at, which is, hey, let's not think about the system. Let's think about the mission. And so, with that, the Vulcan program now serving customers, what specific features, such as its high energy Centaur V upper stage, increased lift performance, and advanced mission assurance systems, best position it to compete in today's rapidly evolving market, especially with the shift towards reusability and sustainability?
Yeah, it's sort of two things in a way. You said it right. This rocket is really architected around the high energy orbit mission. It is most efficient at that. It does the example I used before, direct inject to GSO and other similar exotic orbits that you might have otherwise done with a three core Delta IV heavy rocket or a rocket like that now we do with a single core. And I'm going to lay some really heavy duty rocket science on you here. But you know what? Uh, one core is cheaper than three. And so it's really good at that mission. And it's the most efficient there because it was designed to that. But, lo and behold, it turns out that the largest contract and the largest number of launches we have now are LEO launches. And we pre-positioned the rocket to have flexibility in it. And we think of Vulcan as a modular rocket. It has two different versions of the upper stage. It has a LEO optimized version, which, believe it or not, if you want more mass to LEO, you need a smaller upper stage. Because in a rocket like Vulcan, that's really designed around that direct inject mission, we fly all the way to the LEO regime before the first stage finishes. You can't use all the propellant in the high energy version of Centaur 5 when you're only going to LEO. It's dead weight. So we actually make a smaller one, which gets you more efficiency. And then we have the ability to have, in a way, like four first stages because we've got that big core that does most of the work. But in a first stage, thrust is a driving parameter in performance, less so in an upper stage, which is more about efficiency and ISP. Well, with the solids, we can have 0, 2, 4, or 6. So we're able to tailor it accordingly and have that flexibility to be really, really good at high energy orbits, but also still competitive today in these LEO missions. And then, like I said a minute ago, but you can't stop there. We're going to have to improve that rocket, make it better at LEO, um, and then make it do new things in high energy to support the Space Force. Because dynamic space operations are coming, and the Centaur 5 is a really unique platform to start from in order to enable those capabilities that are just around the corner.
Thank you, Tori. That brings up a two-part question, actually. Vulcan is a transformational step forward for ULA and for the nation. How is ULA preparing for the future needs, like you just discussed or just spoke about, dynamic space operations, cislunar logistics, and advanced upper stage capabilities to support the Space Force? I'll let you answer that one, and then we'll talk about the supply chain resilience need.
Yeah, sure. Well, first you got to get your basic platform, which now we have, and we're just ramping up its launch rate. Then you can improve upon it. But the real key to doing the things you described in your question is, you got to skate to where the puck is going to be. This isn't a consumer electronic device that you can develop in 18 months. It's a heavy class launch vehicle. It takes years. And so you've got to be looking way out and, obviously we take a lot of cues from the Space Force and from what intelligence they share with us, but they also have their day job. When you're in the Air Force, the Space Force, the government, you have just tremendous demands on you every day. And if you're a policymaker, if you're political, you might only be in that job, 4 years. And if you're going to make a difference, you got to focus on things that are material in that span of time. That's too short for the kind of capabilities we were just talking about. So we also have our own vision. We look out into the future and we kind of make our own calls about what we hope what we think, but also hope the government will pick up the phone and call us for, a few years into the future so that we could say, oh, yeah, we've already been working on that for 4 or 5 years. So that's a big part of it. I have a team of people that, it's within our strategy group, but it's really about intelligence and forecasting what we think the country's needs are going to be so that we can make smart investments now and be ready when the phone rings. That's a huge part of it. And, I just want to say a little bit more about dynamic space operations because that's a technical term of art. And I think for the average person that probably goes over their head. We're talking about actively fighting a war in space. That means we've got to have a high degree of mobility where we can move fast, we can make big changes in orbits, we can respond in a dynamic environment where our assets are under an active attack. Got to be able to move things to a safe place, replenish things that have been destroyed, defend ourselves, something that we have lacked until this administration in the trade space we were able to consider. Be no different than an air war. It's just instead of X number of miles, it's 100x number of miles of space that we are trying to control. And we're going to need a whole new set of capabilities. I have been working on that based on the Centaur 5 upper stage for the last dozen years since I got to ULA. I knew that was going to be a need, and we've been investing in it this entire time.
Phenomenal. Yeah, it's a great point about the comparison between the air domain, the space domain. We've been doing war fighting in the air domain for a long time. Now we got to really focus on war fighting in the space domain with a much different physics model, obviously.
Yeah.
So thanks for that. Now, how does ULA's extensive investments in automation and supply chain resilience ensure the U.S. maintains the launch capacity it needs for the next several decades?
Yeah, in the good old days, in the first Cold War, by the way, Bill, I think we're in a second Cold War now. We're just
Yeah.
only slowly realizing it. But in the first one, you build redundancy in the supply chain. You never allowed yourself to have one provider for anything that was important. And that's how it was done. That's not something we can do right now. And you've hit it. We're turning to automation to make the supply chain faster, more robust, shorter cycle times, and less demanding of people because you can always get a robot welder faster than you can get skilled welding technicians, weld designers, and weld NDE experts. So that's the alternative we're using. So we're relying on technology to help us build that resiliency right now. We have You talked about investment. It's not just in automation, it's also been in broadening the capacity of the suppliers we have. I talked about solid rocket motors. The same is true for our liquid rocket propulsion support and then many of our other supply chain elements. But we're also bringing work in house. Vertical integration allows you to have a certain agility that you can't have when sub something out. There's very good reasons why you're going to purchase things where it takes a great deal of investment to build a capability, maybe decades, in fact. And when you do that, if you can only sell to just your needs, your small quantity, it might not ever be affordable. Those are things you should buy. Go to the best people who have a broader base so that they can give you economies of scale. Everything else you want in house. So we're making investments in vertical integration as well through the other parts of the rocket that yesterday we bought, today we're still buying, tomorrow we're going to make them ourselves.
It makes a lot of sense. The vertical integration aspect of it and bringing capabilities in-house is tremendous. Given the diversity of ULA's launch manifest, from broadband satellites to the highest priority national security payloads, what are the key challenges in maintaining mission assurance and flexibility across such different mission profiles?
Yeah, you got to start, with that mission focus that you mentioned a minute ago. We're all rocket scientists here. We love the rockets. We think they're the coolest things in the world. Half the people here, they probably pay us to come to work. I feel that way. But The rocket has no inherent value. It exists only to carry a satellite into space. So you just got to stay focused on that, just laser focused on why we are here to do that mission. And then everything else kind of flows out of that.
Let's talk about public-private partnerships and how important they're becoming, especially now more than ever. What role does a trusted launch provider like ULA play in ensuring that America maintains assured access to space amid increasing commercial competition and geopolitical tension?
Yes, well, you have a certain responsibility there. It's always a business, we say, but it's more than a business. It's a privilege to be in national security, and you become a partner in that national security mission with the Space Force, with whoever your government customer is. It's really, really important that you stay connected at the hip so that not just the sort of things we talked about a minute ago, where we're trying to look 10 years out, but just today, tomorrow, next year. What does your customer need? What are the challenges they're facing? How does your commercial business support that? I'm constantly looking not just to have more infrastructure and a higher launch rate, which is what they originally asked me to do, but how my commercial customer can be leveraged by the National Security Space Mission as well once I get them up and going. And we're not shy about sharing that with that customer as potential growth opportunities for them in the future, and sort of lauding their capabilities inside the Space Force. We also want to be as domestic as we can. you know, this is now pure competition. We have adversaries that are pretty serious people and putting real money and effort into this. And we need to have a supply chain that is secure and robust against infiltration. It used to be that China would work really hard to infiltrate a prime contractor like ULA. They try and compromise our systems. Cyber is always the first attack, but also your people. And then when those became very hard targets, they just moved down into the supply chain. And when the cyber in the supply chain became difficult to penetrate, then they moved to the investment community and began acquiring, beneficial interest in our suppliers, which gives them control as well as insight, as because they're shareholders, their equity in those companies. And so we've had to go to that next step. By the way, we did this before I think it was generally a concern, and before we were certainly asked to, but we first asked all of our supply chain to give us certifications as to who owned them and when and how, and to update that multiple times a year. But like was said during the Reagan era, trust but verify. Not that they would lie to us, but they don't always know, because China continues to evolve, right? So when they knew that was going on, then they'd use shell companies. So we hired a company, a financial company that specializes in drilling through all that. And we get a report once a quarter on who's crept into our supply chain through devious means and is concealing their identity. So, once we started doing that and addressing that, they know that, and we've kind of chased them all out. Everyone needs to do that. The next big vulnerability, I think, for our community is through venture capital and private equity, because as you're trying to evolve and change, and we have new entrants into our space community, which is great, they have a desperate need for investment. The government is not in a position like it used to be in the old days of supporting all of these expenses. They count on private money and private companies to build and innovate and create capability. Well, that means those companies have to go get investors. And that's a big, broad, diverse community, and a lot harder to get insight into in the way I just described.
Yeah, it's a great point about VC willing to invest in the technology that we need to support not just the commercial infrastructure and apparatus that supports the national security apparatus, but specifically supporting uh, cross sectors across the space domain, civil, commercial, and national security. So Very great point. Tori, you've built a reputation for transparent and engaging leadership, something we see in your direct interactions with the public and the aerospace community online. How has open communication helped strengthen ULA's culture and brand during this phase of transformation?
Yeah, well, I think it is important. I mean, it's a personal commitment that I have, but it builds trust. The thing about that is that you can't have teamwork without trust, and you can't get this work done without teamwork. And our industry, and I would say even our acquirer community, is sort of taking this journey. And there's for a little while there was kind of a, I'll say, a vector towards being more transactional in nature, and that carries you away from where you want to be. Number one, we're in this together. It's a team. It's not the government buying tires off the shelf. These are sophisticated, complex systems. They need their providers to be agile because needs are going to change in real time, just like the story I told you through our evolution. And the first tool of a government program manager is that telephone. Something's going on, you call your counterpart, call them 2, 3 times a day. Here, I need this from you. Or you're falling off this milestone. This is what it means to me. How are we going to solve this together? And the same has to be true from the contractor. If you fall into the trap of your first tool being your contracts officer and your attorney sending a letter, well, then the letters start flying both directions, and then everybody's afraid to share anything. God help you if you give them insight and they use that to beat you, like it's a stick, and the whole thing stops, and you've forgotten the fundamental truth, which is both parties have to succeed and win in order for the country to win.
Yeah, we've got an adage here that probably supports exactly what you're describing, which is mutual respect, mutual support develops trust. So it's something we live on a day-to-day basis, and you're doing a phenomenal job, obviously, there at ULA. Interestingly, and not many people probably know this, but you're serving as the honorary chair for World Space Week 2026, aptly named the Rocket Revolution. How can initiatives like the Rocket Revolution, combined with ULA's outreach and early career programs, inspire young people to pursue careers in aerospace engineering and national service?
Yeah, I think this is the best year ever. Well, because the reason is because it really expands that reach of the message. Aerospace is vital to our national security. The world satellite business is this is a more than the U.S. endeavor. This is all of our allies, all of our friends, and a lot of our strength comes through our partnerships. And so we're extending that out to an even broader community. And I think not just reaching the K through 12 in people who are thinking about university careers, but into those STEM professionals that might be thinking about where to apply their STEM careers. Well, the most exciting place to apply it is in space. Come on.
Yeah, I'd say that probably this is the second space revolution, if you will. So you're talking about the rocket revolution, but the fact is, in the late 60s, going to the moon, everyone was really excited about space. And now, what's happening in the space domain is yet another opportunity to bring the whole of globe together around this excitement in space. So I think we are at the precipice of what is going to be, again, the next space era. I talk about it often is this is the first generation that's growing up today. That's the space native generation, where they probably have a capability knowledge gap, where they don't quite understand exactly all the benefits they have because of what space provides. But I can tell you their lives would completely change if they didn't have those capabilities available to them. Speaking of young professionals and future engineers who might be listening today, what advice would you offer for building a meaningful career in an industry that's evolving faster than ever before?
Oh, it's two things. It's understanding that it's about service. Work on something that is greater than yourself, which we get to do in our industry. Whether it's a commercial application that's connecting the whole globe and providing information. And by the way, that's an extension of our soft power. You cannot be free until you are first free in your mind, and you can't achieve that without access to information. So serve. Know that you're serving. Know that the work that you do matters and it's important. And then dropping down to a tactical level, I always tell, young aerospace professionals to run to the fire. When there's some gnarly thing going on in your team or your department or your division, and you see everybody running away from it, that's where you want to go engage. If you think you can help, you should volunteer. When you work problems like that, two things happen. The first is your learning is accelerated tenfold. The second thing is in our world, we manage by exception. And what I mean by that is things that are going really well don't get much attention. Everybody's focused on the problems to get them solved. So if you're in there in that gnarly fur ball and everybody else fled, and you are helping, then you'll be noticed for that, and you'll be given more opportunities to learn even more and make an even bigger impact.
Phenomenal words from a phenomenal leader. Tory Bruno, true Space Force champion. Thank you for taking time to join us on the Spacepower podcast. Between the recent Viasat 3 mission, Project Kuiper, now known as Amazon Leo, success, your ongoing work with the U.S. Space Force, the fielding of Vulcan, and investing in America's industrial base, it is a wonder you have any time at all. But it is also clear ULA is helping shape the future of assured access to space and the deterrence posture our nation depends on. The evolution there at ULA reflects something deeper as well. America cannot project power in space without launch, and launch cannot succeed without a strong, resilient industrial base. And that's exactly what you represent for the entire team at ULA and your leadership there. To our listeners, thank you for tuning in. To learn more about the Space Force Association and upcoming episodes, visit spaceforceassociation.org and follow us on social media. Until next time, I'm Bill Woolf, and this is the Space Power Podcast.
Thanks, Bill. This was fun.
Thank you, sir.
We make it clear.